Okay, handouts are going around. Different from the homework, if you looked at that on the website. Those homework questions are good just for getting our juices flowing, getting the thoughts going about the chapter. The handout that's coming around now is more to kind of follow our train of thought or activity during class. So, we are in Daniel chapter 3 tonight in our weekly study on Wednesday nights of the book of Daniel. And on your handout, the first section there is a little bit of a review. So I'm going to give you some time to do this on your own, and you can talk to people around you if you would like to. If you'd like to prove yourself, happy for you to do that. But if you'd like to talk about it and get some help from each other, feel free to do that as well. So I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes here to answer these handful of questions here at the top of your handout. They're also on the screen about the style of the book, the language of the book, and then a question about chapter 2, which we covered last week, and what chapter kind of pairs up with chapter 2 in terms of its message and themes. So work on that for 3 minutes or so, and then we will jump in. Okay, we'll jump in here. So ask you the same questions, but we'll look back at the charts that we've been looking at for the structure of the book of Daniel. So the first question was about the style of writing. Hopefully these questions make sense, and if you've been here, hopefully the wording we've used in class helped you to understand what we were talking about. But the first 6 chapters are in one style that is really, especially once you notice it, very distinct from the second half of the book, 7 to 12. So what style is the first 6 chapters written in? Story or narrative is the fancy word. Thank you, Michael. Story or narrative, and therefore much easier to follow and understand what's going on most of the time, because chapters 7 to 12 is written in what style? Vision, or a prophecy, maybe you could say as well about that, but we'll say it's written in vision. Visions that Daniel in particular sees. Okay, so the next one's a little bit of a trick question maybe, but the question is, which section is written in a different language than the rest of the book? There we go. We weren't tricked by it. Okay, it's actually not one of the 2 sections we've already discussed, because there's overlap here. But chapter 2 to chapter 7, so mostly story, but also the first of the visions in the second half of the book, is written in Aramaic. Now, do you remember something that we've said? Well, I asked this question first. The rest of the book is written in what language? In Hebrew, okay? And does anybody remember the difference? What would you say about Aramaic that is kind of its distinctive quality as compared to Hebrew? Understood by more people, Terry says. Yeah, it's more universal. Again, maybe think of it as like the English of today. Okay, more and more people are using that as a language of business because it's more universal across the world. But especially we're talking about a region of the world where Aramaic would have been common amongst people, as opposed to Hebrew that would have been, for the most part, only understood by the people of Judah, or Judea, the Israelite people. Okay. And we're making the case in this class that language difference also points us to a difference in the main point or the main theme of that particular section. So, this very last part of the book, written in Hebrew, again, understood only by the Jews, has a message, as we will see, that God, in all the crazy things happening in the world over the coming centuries, God is taking care of His special people, okay, the Jewish people, right? But what is the message of this Aramaic, more universally understood section? Does anybody remember that? That's not on your quiz, I know. But anybody remember the theme, in a phrase, in a sentence, of chapters 2 to 7? Yeah, God's in the dealings of everyday man, Jordan. Yeah, kingdoms of man. So put all that together. God is ruling specifically in the kingdoms of mankind. And you can see, and hopefully we are seeing as we go through, that this is a message that needs to be understood universally, right? That all, maybe especially the kings like Nebuchadnezzar, need to learn this lesson, that God is in control and God is ruling over the dealings of the kingdoms of this earth, okay? So that's chapter 2 to 7 is clearly its own unit with its own theme. But even within chapter 2 to 7, we've noticed somewhat of a structure, and this gets to your third question on your review. So we studied chapter 2 last week. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, a vision of a statue that represented the four kingdoms, and it was supplanted by God's eternal kingdom. Which chapter pairs up in terms of its message with chapter 2? Chapter 7. Okay, thank you, Denise. Chapter 7 is going to tell the same story, just with different images. Instead of a statue of four metals, it's going to be four beasts that represent four kingdoms. Instead of a rock that crushes the statue, we're going to see the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne and the Son of Man ascending to take the kingship over an everlasting kingdom. Same exact message in two different ways. But that's the kind of bookends of this section that's written in Aramaic. Tonight, we're talking about chapter 3, in which, not to spoil the story, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue, and they are threatened with being thrown in the fiery furnace, and they are, but they are rescued, or they survive by God's help. And what other chapter, what story, other story in the book of Daniel is, again, same exact story with different characters? Daniel in the lion's den, chapter 6, okay? Daniel's going to be told you have to not pray to any other god, okay? But King Darius, Daniel says, I refuse to not do that. I'm going to continue to pray. Oh, you're going to be thrown in the lion's den, okay? He is, and he's rescued. He's saved, delivered by God from that, okay? And then we'll see that chapters 4 and 5, which we'll study over the next 2 weeks, will be the same sort of thing. Similar stories with different characters, but have a similar point that's being made. So tonight, we're going to focus on chapter 3 and talk about what point is being made from chapter 3, and that point will only be reinforced when we get to chapter 6. Okay, perfect, right on time. Let's move to Daniel chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles open, you can be looking at that. As we did last week, we're going to read a little bit at a time. And those verses are marked on your handout. They'll also be marked on the screen. But we'll read a little bit at a time and discuss some things as we go. So let's start with chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, and read the setup of this story. You remember at the end of chapter 2, because Daniel was able to interpret that dream of the statue, he was exalted himself in verse 48, and in verse 49, he arranged for his three compatriots, whose Babylonian names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to rule in the provinces of Babylon, while Daniel remained in the king's court. So, following that, Daniel chapter 3, verse 1 says that King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." okay, talk amongst yourselves for just a couple minutes, and then I want to hear your ideas. Think about this story in connection with the story from chapter 2. And think about King Nebuchadnezzar's actions in this story in light of what he saw and what happened in chapter 2. And talk about if there's anything interesting there, anything ironic, anything significant about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is acting the way he is after the events of chapter 2 previously transpired. Talk for a couple minutes, and then we'll share out. What do you make of Nebuchadnezzar's actions, particularly related to all the stuff from chapter 2?
And then I don't know how long a span this was, but now he's got a short memory. And he's had to build something that's image out of gold that was nothing. Just a golden image.
Yeah, Dan says he had made this great confession of sorts, and back in chapter 2, verse 47, "You're God, Daniel, God of gods and Lord of kings." Like you said, short memory. What else would you say about Nebuchadnezzar's actions? Ian?
It's ironic because of the prophecy, the interpretation of the dream. He still decides to do this. It's like the interpretation almost inspired. He's like, oh, this is a great idea. I'm going to build this giant idol of myself. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, and so Ian's pointing out the similarity between the images, right? Literally the images, the imagery in chapters 2 and chapter 3. But what's the difference? I think I heard, maybe it was Albert, not that I was eavesdropping, but what's the difference between the dream he had of a statue and the statue that he builds? Yeah, it's all gold, okay? So in the dream, he's the gold head, which is a pretty prominent position. We notice, actually, that God, through Daniel, was praising Nebuchadnezzar as being a pretty great king, at least in terms of power and majesty, okay? But he was just the head. And as Ian says, he gets that idea and said, well, I don't want to just be the head. I want to be the whole thing of gold. And so he makes... Now, we don't know what the image is, what it looks like, okay? But that's at least one theory that is plausible, that the image was a representation of him. But again, there's other possibilities with that too, okay? Maybe one more observation about Nebuchadnezzar's actions here in light of chapter 2. Anything else different that anybody talked about? Interesting. So Dan, thank you, Dan. Dan says the idea about control. What was kind of the whole message of the vision from chapter 2? Yeah, God's in control, okay? So, short memory, he had just declared Daniel's God, the God of gods and Lord of kings. Here he is, excluding any worship from any other god. Say you have to bow down to this statue. Making himself, for instance, or at least possibility, making himself the entire statue as opposed to just the head of gold. And then wanting to be in control, force everybody right into conformity when he was just shown who was really in control. Okay, let's keep going. It's good. Chapter 3, we'll pick up reading in verse 8 and see where this goes. The proclamation had been made to play the instruments, to bow down. And so in verse 8, the story continues. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, that's Babylonians, Chaldea, Babylonia, same thing. Certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made the decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace, because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. Okay, we will stop right there. The moment of the most tension. But on your handout, you have a little more detail, so a few categories perhaps to jog your thinking. But let's just discuss for the next 10 minutes or so the difference, the contrast that's being revealed to us about the nature of those in Babylon, the king in particular, but the other Babylonians as well, the enemies of God's people, we might classify them, and then God's people themselves, and this particularly the 3 Hebrew youths. So let's talk about the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and the others. What do we learn about the enemies of God's people, the Babylonians in particular, from the way this story is playing out? There's some good P words here, some plotting, prejudice. Okay, did you hear that in the language that was used, right? How do they describe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Certain Jews, right? There's clearly like we say, a prejudice, here. You understand, even in some ways, regardless of their ethnic background, they're the exile. They're the people we've brought here to serve us, and they're causing trouble. Okay, these certain Jews, and there's a conspiring. And damage and jealousy. Now, if we can this may not be too hard to put ourselves in their shoes. You're in the shoes of these other officials. Remember back to the end of chapter 2, what might you be thinking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the place that they hold in the kingdom? Yeah, because how'd they get there in the first place? Yeah, they didn't do anything to deserve it, right? Daniel used his position, right? And so maybe we'll put up with Daniel, although maybe not for long. But these guys, they're Jews, they're exiles, they're usurping our position. They didn't deserve it, right? So there's this kind of conspiring against them. And Dan relates that back to jealousy, which I think is probably warranted. What else would you say, Brian?
I find interesting Daniel and the others had not done any offense against any of them. They were harmless. In fact, because of their wisdom and so forth, they prospered the kingdom and did well. But because of their jealousy or God's people always been persecuted. They're persecuting these people, and they're persecuting them to the death. They're looking to have them murdered by the king, which sounds like the crucifixion.
Sure, yeah, they are, and it's interesting. The accusation given about them in verse 12 is they pay no attention to you, right? Do we think that's a fair accusation that they're paying no attention to Nebuchadnezzar? Probably not. It seems kind of trumped up, we might say. But they've just been going about their business. They've become the target of this. Let's get Ian and then Albert.
Just building upon other things that have been said here. I mean, you get like a hint of racism here. I mean, they're Babylonians, and now they have a king that's wanting to integrate people all over from all of the provinces and bring them in and mesh all these ideas and gods and religions. I mean, we see how quickly he accepted, our God as his God. Just throw it in with the lump sum of all of them. And I think these are some of the, the pure Babylonians here. Like, they don't want to mix. They don't want a mixed breed. They feel entitled to these higher positions and these gifts that Nebuchadnezzar is giving all these foreigners.
Thank you, Ian. And Ian used the word integrate in terms of the goal of Nebuchadnezzar's decree. I want to come back to that in a second. Albert, you had guaranteed you the last word here before we move on.
So I take a step back and look at my own self, and then I think, coming out of a Catholic background, and I mean, we prayed to a lot of saints, and we prayed, to where idol worship and God, lowercase, worship at this time was prevalent, and it wasn't. We have in the New Testament, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and you're just seeing these people worried about their daily bread, and you see, if he says to wave at this statue, I'm going to wave at this statue. So you see people caught up into the here and now in this world, living day to day, whereas we can do that, but yet our charge is to think of the bigger picture and not worry about those things. God will provide. And so wrong is wrong, and I'm not saying but I kind of sympathize with them a little bit, or empathize possibly with these folks, and the fact that they get caught up in this world and worrying about this world, and then they get jealous and they start to manipulate, they start to do things, and I myself can get caught up in 2022.
Well, thank you, Albert. If you had to identify, the sin, so to speak, right, the misdeed of these three, what is it that they're really guilty of when it comes down to it in the eyes of the Babylonians? Yeah, you're not going along, we might say. You're not going along. And Ian, I think, was mentioning there, alluding to this. You see this language throughout chapter 3. What Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is take all these people and get them on a unified kind of, get them on one page, right? All bow down to one statue. Nebuchadnezzar is, and he's called this, he's the King of Kings. He rules over all these different kingdoms. He's trying to bring everybody into line, right, to conform to this one way of thinking, one way of doing things, okay? And the sin of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is saying, we're not going to go along, okay? We refuse to go along, right? Yeah, everyone else is doing it, okay? And if you put yourself in their shoes, you can see why they would just naturally go along. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, we're not going to, right? We're going to stand firm, right, and not bow down, literally, in this case, okay? And that leads us to this. So what else do you want to say about the Hebrew youth themselves, the response and the words and the actions of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What stands out to you in terms of an example set for God's people in all times and places to emulate? Thank you, Dan. Dan said they had faith in God. May come back to that. Jamie, who they were and who they serve. Remember who you are and who it is that you serve. Brian?
I'm just always impressed with this particular verse, because what they really say is God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we're going to obey. And that's, I'll repeat that for the microphone. They say that they have faith in God that he will deliver them, or he has the power to deliver them if that's his will. But if it's not his will, we're still going to obey. We're going to obey our God.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. And it is, Dan mentioned they have faith in God, but as Brian points out, this to me is one of the most stunning things about the whole chapter, is they acknowledge in a way that they don't know what the outcome of the story is going to be, right? they don't really know that the fiery furnace isn't going to hurt them, okay? And if you and I were standing there and feeling the, heat kind of wafting off of it, we may not think that we were going to be protected from it either, right? But to them, that didn't really matter in the end. In the end, what mattered is we're not going to bow down regardless, okay? But we do know God can do it, and it seems like they have at least an inclination that he might, but even if he doesn't, right? Even if he doesn't, we're still not going to go along, okay?
I would just add to a current application is praying to God. We know that God hears our prayers and he answers prayer, and I've seen the example of dramatic examples of God's answered prayer, but I've also seen many times that we pray for something and it does not come to pass. Perhaps we're praying for somebody not to die and they die. That's God's will, but you remain faithful nonetheless.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. And it does. I think it's, as Brian is saying, it tells us something about what we should be praying. Praying for the deliverance is fine and something we're commanded to do. But the rest of that prayer, and even if not, then what are we praying for? Okay? What if the person doesn't get better? What if the baby doesn't make it? What if the cancer doesn't go away? What if the world around us gets more hostile to Christians? Okay, what then? Right? And if we're only praying for these things to be removed from us, then maybe we can learn from the example of these three to say, but even if not, give us courage, wisdom, trust, patience, whatever it is. But even if not, right? Okay, there's a couple of hands that were up. I think Ian, Albert's closer to the mic, so proximity here.
Just riding coattails here, but it just reminds me of the Apostle Paul, whether I live or whether I die. And the spirit was, if I live, then I'm here to help. If I die, what a great blessing to be judged accordingly. So.
Yeah, amen. Thank you, Albert. And Ian? Or let's go Joanna on your way over there, Michael.
And kind of going along with what Albert said, it's similar to also what Esther said, if I perish, I perish. So along kind of the same lines.
Yeah, and it's obviously a similar historical context about an exile, really, standing in a place where she doesn't belong and yet showing that courage. Thank you, Joanna. Ian?
I think there's a lot to unpack here in their response, but I'll try and keep it brief. Just obviously they had been taught well about the history of Israel, and I think you can see them looking back here maybe at the original Exodus, freedom from bondage from Egypt, and what Israel did in worshiping false idols and what came of it. And I think they're showing some wisdom here. They've been taught Scripture, they've been taught about the past, about their heritage, and they have this fundamental understanding of what faith is. But I also think you really strongly see the correlation between persecution and how that ties to can tie to strengthening faith here. And through the persecution and through all these laws that are trying to prohibit them from worshiping God, they don't turn from God. They gain strength through that persecution. And that's inspiring, I think, for us as Christians.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. This is an old Bible I had to pull out of the shelf because mine was stolen on the side of the road. They were after the computer, but my Bible's in the same bag. But little do they know, they got the most valuable gift of all. I had in this old Bible here, 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7 written down in the margin. In this you rejoice, your salvation, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, right? That's a perfect image for this story. May be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So in this case, it did. It purified them and strengthened them. And as Ian points out, they knew the stories to fall back on. By the way, who do we think taught Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego the stories of Israel's past? I'm going to guess their parents, maybe among others. Maybe they were also listening to Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel too. Okay? All right. Let's see where we're at here. Yeah, let's Anything else on the example of the Hebrews here? Yeah, AG, maybe. Oh, I'll get you in there, David.
Just what I was going to say, they stood throughout this first 3 chapters, they stood for what they believed in. You know, you see that from Daniel asking to get different food. Second chapter, they're about to die. What do? They go to God and they pray, and time again, they stood for what they believed in. And for youth, for all of us, it's a good lesson that we can learn that when we're faced with difficulties of standing up against people, we still do what is right, no matter what it cost us.
Thank you, H.E. And do so in prayer. Thank you. David, last word here.
It's pretty bold of them to say in front of this tyrant, we have no need to respond to you. I mean, that's pretty brazen. So, I mean, it was just because of their faith, but still, took a lot of courage to say that. So.
No, thank you. Yeah, man, even when you said that, I'm like, oh yeah. How hard would that be, right? To stand up to the new Pharaoh in this story, Nebuchadnezzar, King of Kings of all people. Okay, so last we left them before commercial break, they were thrown, bound, in verse 23, into the fiery furnace. So let's read the rest of the story here. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Okay, about 8 minutes left. So I want you guys to discuss again amongst yourselves, and then we'll share out to close the class. Remember that this is in the section of Daniel that we're suggesting is meant to be understood more universally by a broader, even a non-Hebrew audience. So for all the lessons we talked about that are for God's people, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego teach us, what would you say is the message that's intended from this story to go to a wider audience, to a non-Hebrew audience? What message would others, perhaps like Nebuchadnezzar, but others even in Babylon or around the region, take from Daniel chapter 3 and how it all ends up? Discuss that together for a couple minutes, and then we'll share out before we close. Yeah. All right, 4 minutes or so before the second bell rings. So what do you guys want to say about this? What did you talk about in your groups? A message that this story sends to the other people, non-Hebrews. There's something special about him. What in particular, by the way, is said about him that makes him special in the text? So Jordan says there's something special about this God, the God of the Hebrews. And in the text, what particularly is pointed out that's special about him? No other God can do what? Deliver or rescue or save his people, right? So obviously a lot of things set God apart as the God of gods. But in particular in this chapter, it's No other God saves his people, rescues his people like this. Terry, you got something?
With them, but God is a God, okay, thank you. God is a God over fire. God, there's nothing that he can't control, that he can't do. He controls everything.
Yeah.
And he just rules over everything. And he wants everybody to follow, obey his commandments versus the commands of some king who thinks more highly of himself than the one who sets him up, and that is God. And God alone.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. So now Terry gives us a second thing to add to that. No other God like God. And so if you're a king like Nebuchadnezzar who's trying to basically bring the world in subjection to yourself, you better watch out, right? Because this God, is not matched, and you can't compete with them. All right, would be the point. Other things you would say about this, John?
They were setting them up to bring down Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and instead they were put even further up. And so, going up against God, not only are you going to lose, but the opposite of what you're trying to achieve can be possible.
Thank you, John. So God is a God that saves his people. You try to attack those people, you try to persecute those people, which, by the way, as we're seeing and we'll continue to see, really, that's the rest of the book of Daniel. The Babylonians are trying to do it. The Persians will try to do it. But then all the visions in the second half of the book are mainly about the coming kingdoms, Persian and then Greek, that will try to continue to stamp out God's people. And as John points out, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story here, to tell any non-Hebrew reading this, you mess with God's people, you're messing with, as Terry said, God himself, who can't be matched. And so it's not going to end up going good for you, and God's people are only going to end up being exalted as much as you try to stamp them out. Like the Israelites in the first Exodus. Okay, the more Pharaoh tried to squeeze on them and keep them locked up in captivity, by the end they were running away with all of his stuff, and he was drowned at the bottom of the Red Sea. Okay. Any other thoughts on this, Michael?
I think it. Two words come to mind. It would grab the attention of the non-Hebrew audience. Whoa, that's pretty crazy what happened. And then it would also garner respect for the God that made that happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Is anybody else thinking of the same story I am? Someone who is non-Israelite that said, "We've heard, and we're in terror of what your God can do. Therefore, I'll do whatever you need me to do to help you out." Who's that? Rahab, right? Okay, same idea. Last word, Brian, then we'll wrap up here.
Well, of course, in this life, clearly God shelters our physical senses from the spiritual. It's revealed to us through his word, but there are those times when God intervenes through signs, miracles that Christ performed, that the prophets performed. And in this instance, we've got two miracles, the identification of the dream, the interpretation of the dream, and surviving the flames. But it reminds me of this present generation as well as back then. I have to sort of paraphrase from Isaiah. These people will hear but not hear. These people will see and not see. Nebuchadnezzar witnessed these things, pronounced the glory of God and how powerful he is, but it didn't have an effect on him at all, nor those around him, and it does not appear, as the Lion's Den example reveals.
And we'll pick up there on next Wednesday with the story of Nebuchadnezzar himself and see if he's learned anything for real or not. So handout is already on the website for next Wednesday's class for the homework, and we'll pick up in Daniel 4 then. Thank you all very much. That was fun.